the director of the Sigur Center for Asian Studies at the George Washington University. I also am a historian of modern Afghanistan, so it gives me particular pleasure to welcome Nivi Manchanda here today. This is the Sigur Center's second New Books in Asian Studies lectures that we've had online. I very much wish that I could welcome you all in person, and no more so wishing I could do so to Nivi, but this is the reality we live in. And indeed, actually, I know that many people are coming in from all over the world to join today's conversation. So there is that bright side to it. For those of you who have followed Nivi's work, as I have for many years, Nivi is now at Queen Mary University in London. Having moved there from Leiden, she did her PhD, I think in Polis, the political science department at the University of Cambridge. And she's worked for quite a long time on issues of political theory, decolonization, and in particular, how they apply to Afghanistan. Nivi's book, as she will talk about here in a minute, is literally hot off the presses. I believe it came out last week with Cambridge University Press. We have links both to the publisher as well as to other places that you can purchase copies. And I would encourage you, and I'm sure you will all be very interested in doing so by the time we get to the end of this conversation. So with that, Nivi, where have you disappeared to? You speak up, you'll just pop right up. I know you're on mute.
Is that
there? You go.
Yeah.
Yep. Excellent. Well, welcome, Nivi. Thank you for taking the time to talk with a global audience today. It's a great pleasure to have you here. I'm so excited. As I told you this morning, I spent the day reading the book yesterday and thoroughly enjoyed it, and would really like to use this as an opportunity for the audience to hear what I think is going to be a critically important book, both in Afghan studies, but more broadly in post-colonial studies and post-colonial theory. So with that, I just kind of start with a broad question asking, why did you write this book? And how did you come to writing this book? And in writing this book, what are you seeking to accomplish?
Thanks so much, Ben, and thanks for hosting me. This is really exciting. I wrote the book as a PhD thesis in its first iteration. So this was what I worked on at Cambridge. At the time, I was really interested in the war on terror and specifically knowledge production and how intervention in certain places, Iraq and Afghanistan predominantly, was justified to the public. I became increasingly interested in Afghanistan because it seemed like there wasn't that much work being done on it, and specifically on Anglophone, so nations of Afghanistan. The overarching theme of the book is the racialized and taken for granted nature of colonial knowledge, which disguises itself as the only right way of knowing. And so I hope that the book accomplishes to complicate and even repudiate this account of colonial knowledge. I feel like that is the thing that I most hope it manages to convey.
So I warned you beforehand that I would take some quotations and throw them at you to have you think about your own writing. And in reading the introduction this morning, I was really taken how you really put it out there. You say, stripped to its essentials, imagining Afghanistan asks two simple but cardinal questions. First, how is Afghanistan thought about in a way such that it is possible to invade and bomb it? And second, what are the sources of authority that sanction the discourses that make the act of invasion permissible and possible in the first place? So you, as it were, set up your own trap, and I'm going to ask you to answer your own question here. How do you answer that in the book?
So you want me to answer the sort of steps I take to answer it rather than the 300-page account that I actually the book is that. So I suppose those two questions are linked. And a lot of the book tries to go through different periods of time where Afghanistan is constructed as an alien other, as backward. So for instance, during the British interventions or imperial incursions of the 20th century, and then much more sort of century. So, and one of the things that I think the book tries to show is that the reason this was possible, well, one of the reasons is post-colonial knowledge, as we say. So, the third world or the global south or whatever other problematic term is always presented as needing to be saved, to be rescued, to be amended, and sometimes to be destroyed. So those are the kind of options that are presented, and that goes back to colonialism and perhaps even before that. But one of the reasons that Afghanistan stands out is because of its kind of slightly unorthodox history. So it was never properly or fully colonized. And I'm not trying to say that there is a full colonization, but if you were to look at its neighbor, for instance, there was an institutional apparatus dedicated to empire in India. This wasn't quite done with Afghanistan. So Afghanistan remained on the margins of both empire and therefore of knowledge produced by empire around it. And so it just became something much easier to intervene in some ways, rather than actually studied or engaged with as an actor in its own right. That doesn't quite do justice to the whole account, but I hope it gives you a glimpse of what I'm trying to say in the book.
Well, actually, that's great, because further in the book, you expand on this idea, the reality that Afghanistan was only fleetingly ever formally integrated into an imperial space, and you refer to it as quasi-coloniality. I wonder if you could maybe expand on both what you mean by that term. Obviously, there's a historical element to that, but there's also a theoretical element I think you're trying to get at with that. And if you could talk about what Afghanistan's, as it were, exclusion from empire has done to both its past and its present, and as your book really gets to, how we understand and imagine those.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I think Afghanistan's status as a sort of liminal country, so first as a buffer zone between what Britain calls two meaningful entities, the Soviet Union and India, really shaped its status in the imperial imagination. It was never, it was often subject to some quite invasive restructuring and colonial intervention, but it was never brought into the remit of empire proper. It wasn't the jewel in the imperial crown. It wasn't even considered. It's not part of the Commonwealth today, for instance. It was never thought of as a British or Soviet or American or whatever else. It was not a colony proper. And I think that says a lot about the way in which we study empire, because this quasi-colonial entity says a lot about colonial anxiety, and that comes out in the archives. And even today, Afghanistan is something that is shrouded in mystery, and then the way we understand it is through shorthands like the graveyard of empires. But it also says something about colonial power, that it isn't as complete or as totalizing as it's often made to be. So Afghanistan in that case is not just liminal, but it has things to say about other places, and about colonial and colonizing tentacles. Like, they aren't always complete, they aren't always finished, they're not totalizing, but that doesn't mean that those interventions are any less colonial or any less horrific or any less significant. And I think some of this book tries to bring that story to the fore by saying Afghanistan is actually quite significant, even if it's on the periphery, even if it has been marginalized.
So one of our audience members has actually kind of expanded on this with regard to the question that you brought up, because you talk about Afghanistan both in the book and just in your answer there. It's hinted at in the book, more than fully expanded, that Afghanistan kind of presents an archetype, that it is this liminal space, one of many on the edges of an imperial order in the 19th century or a global order in the 20th century. I think we can all think of spaces kind of similarly situated on the outlands, whether it be someplace like Somalia, for example, or the Democratic Republic of Congo. And so with that use of the word archetype and respecting that in part your work is really speaking to theory as much as it is specifically to the place of Afghanistan, I wonder if you could expand on that. What lessons do you think we can take from your interrogation and examination of Afghanistan and apply those elsewhere while still respecting the particularity of the story of Afghanistan?
Yeah, thanks. I think the first lesson, and that's quite a generic lesson, is just that imperial hubris is very much still alive, and it still keeps giving. And Afghanistan's story, going back to the 18th century, but also in the 21st century, is not so much a story of empire collapsing or meeting its match or being the graveyard, but just of empire's lack of knowledge that stems from its arrogance and from its and also from just the idea that conquering a place is the way to know it, and or knowing it is another way to conquer it. Either of those two things. And I think that that's been made by some post-colonial theorists, Homi Bhabha I'm thinking about how empire is often a disjunctured hybrid, or not quite as, it's not a smooth process. And in the cracks and in the fissures, you can tell a different but also quite important story of empire. And I think Afghanistan hopefully adds to that theorizing of empire. And I'm talking about empire quite broadly. So I'm talking about empire in the 21st century as well, which I know is contentious, but I'm not just talking about British colonial intervention. Yeah.
Well, that brings me to my next question. As you're talking about empire, which actually makes me want to back the conversation up a little bit, and that is to think about your intended audience. Who are you trying to speak to with this book? Because one of the things that I think is a real strength of the work and that I find really attractive is that it talks across a number of disciplines. I mean, clearly your training obviously is in international relations theory. You're taking a critical position and lens on this as a post-colonial theorist. But there's history in here, there's sociology, there's anthropology, a kind of virtual jack of all trades you become in this. And so I wonder if you can talk a little bit about your intended audience, both disciplinarily, but I hear from what you're saying that you want to intervene in an academic conversation, but an academic conversation that has real world implications. And indeed, there's a sense of a kind of activist scholarship throughout the work. And so I'd invite you to expand on that as we talk about the audience you're trying to reach here.
Yeah, the audience question is a good one. It's also a tricky one because I think in the first instance, I was told to make the book legible and speak to an international. The initial momentum behind it, I realized that was not something I really wanted to do. I was not attached to that project. And so it does try to speak to a whole host of disciplines, absolutely anthropology and history, but also hopefully some cultural studies and area studies as well. So it is quite a broad-based audience. It is fairly academic, but like you say, these academic works, or some of their import anyway, filter through into the realm of public discourse. So I'd like for it to be read by a whole host of people. And I think a lot of people might end up hating it and disagreeing with me, but that doesn't necessarily change the fact that the intended audience, when I think about it now, perhaps not as explicitly as when I was writing it, would be people who might be interested in policy or might be interested in development, as well as a whole host of academic audiences.
Okay, I'm gonna push you back here because you just said you think there's going to be people that hate it. Who who do you think is going to not engage with the ideas? What kind of criticisms do you think this book will run into, or have you in your previous publications run into that have informed this?
So I think some of that would be in what you kind of said, like that it isn't a disciplinary book. So any discipline that picks it up, a historian will definitely point to its historical weaknesses. An IR scholar would, laugh at its lack of abstract theorizing. Cultural studies probably thinks that it's almost too, that perhaps it's not arcane enough. I just think that there's those people might not hate it, but they will find limitations. The people who hate it might be, and I could be wrong, would be if somebody who is actively, so a military person is quite likely to hate it, for instance, if there was somebody who was going into private security in Afghanistan and picks it up. I mean, they probably won't pick it up, but if they do, they might hate it. Or people who also, I feel like it might also, hate is too strong a word, but it might not be to everyone's taste in that it is trying to do some of that scholar activism. So, it could be criticized for its lack of scholarly rigor. I haven't heard any of this to my face yet. As you say, it's only just been out, so I'm waiting for that kind of backlash.
I would be surprised if you encounter that. But let's then talk a little bit, since you have in your mind kind of a discussion that this will fit into. I wonder if you could place this in that discussion in the literature. This, in one way, really takes a torch, as it were, and substantially advances some really dynamic literature that's come out in the last decade or so. People like Elizabeth Leake or Timothy Noonan, Martin Bailey, all of whom you very generously tip your hat to in the book. So I wonder, on the one hand, how you see this as a complement to some of the emerging scholarship out there, but on the other hand, how you also see that it differs, advanced. What does this add that has not been said yet, and how does this advance that discussion?
Yeah, absolutely. All the people you pointed to have been key interlocutors, and your own book, The Making of Modern Afghanistan, was absolutely key to the PhD and to the book. Some of those works are primarily historical. So one of the things I think I try to look at colonial lineages, and I get a lot out of those books that also interrogate colonial lineages, but then bring it to the 21st century and see how those things have changed or not changed, and how Afghanistan is constructed and reconstructed and intervened upon across a few centuries. That's one thing. The other thing I think is that it does look at quite a lot of different, so each chapter is quite thematic. So while trying to have a narrative arc about Afghanistan's representation, it also tries to look at individual things or aspects or themes. So, the gender is quite a big thing. And then I look at representations of men and women. Then there's the idea of the Afghan state, and look at IR discourse. And it also tries to do, it's methodologically quite eclectic. So, it looks at his archives, but then it also looks at film, and it looks at popular sort of media discourse. So I think it's a little bit more like mixed or eclectic and slightly broader, and therefore perhaps not as systematic or as focused on one thing. It tries to do quite a lot of different things, and that was because I was interested in quite a lot of different things and in a lot of different types of discourses and a lot of different. So I think that sets me aside a little bit from some of those works.
Well, it does a lot of things, and it does them very, very well. And your answer is really kind of, I'm not sure where to go because there's so much richness in there. I'll take it as the historian's hat, because you bring up that a lot of the literature that's emerged in the past 15 years or so have been historians. And your own work, the book, time is an interesting character in your work, in the sense of, by no means are you flattening the narrative or even the analysis, namely saying, you know, what the British did then, the Americans are doing now, that there's kind of a direct line from the past to the present. And yet time plays an interesting role in your story about how it does inform the present and how it's often forgotten as well or ignored. So I wonder if you could talk about the book's temporality some. And by that, I mean how you have these diverse incidents, whether it be British imperialism or the Soviet intervention or modern American intervention, and how you relate these both for their continuities and their discontinuities, appreciating that they happen in really temporally distinct moments, and that the world and Afghanistan and the actors are different at each point.
Yeah, that's a really excellent question. And actually, time and temporality, I've thought a lot about almost after I wrote the book. They're present in the book, but more recently, I've been trying to do some work with Avery Gordon's concept of hunting, which she builds on from Derrida. And I think there's a lot in there in Afghanistan. There's lots of temporal tropes. So, for instance, Afghanistan is always constructed as backwards or temporally behind, and that's been used to justify intervention. Johannes Fabian's Time and the Other really also got me interested in the ways in which, you know, it's both space and time. So it's not just a third world that's different from us and therefore needs to be intervened on, but also it's temporally behind us, the narratives of time. And Afghanistan really is great for that, because on the one hand, people try to present it as a timeless. On the other hand, a lot of what's happening in Afghanistan is very much of the present moment, and that the timelessness erases some of the differences that you encounter. So, for instance, I was speaking to somebody about this yesterday, that when the British encountered Afghanistan, or had their first sort of engagements with it on the question of gender, Afghanistan was considered super progressive, and there was this idea that Afghan women were too wild and they needed to be curtailed, and they needed to be, they're in harems, and that, and now, of course, it's all about Afghan women being backward. And then the story then becomes Afghan women have always been backward. Or alternatively, the other thing is to try to pick points or narratives that don't completely meet this story, and they say, okay, well, Afghan women had miniskirts on in the 1970s, so there was a brief moment where they weren't backwards, and that's where we want to get them back to, and it's gone back. So time is everywhere, and it's and I don't spend as much time unpacking, ironically enough, as I would have liked to. But I think there is a story about time and about Afghanistan's political landscape and how it has changed or not changed, and how the narratives themselves try to make sense of it temporally.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I really appreciate in your work is this tension between this, on the one hand, timelessness about Afghanistan, or the way that it's imagined, that it's filled with wild people who go back to antiquity, if not further, and yet at the same time, you're very assiduous in juxtaposing that with a constant change and churn, both in the historical record, but how we understand Afghanistan. We're getting a lot of questions from the participants, which is exciting, because this is a conversation we want to engage everybody in. So I'm going to pick one or two of those out, some of which are on my own mind. And one of them has brought up the issue of your sources. You've talked a little bit about them when we were talking about how you really do cut across a number of disciplines here. I mean, you've done some fantastic archival research in the book. You pick up popular press reporting. You've done a lot with a lot of different sources in this. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your sources, what they are, how you approach them, what they can and what they can't tell you, and how you have critically treated them in the book.
Yeah, thanks. So to start from what they can't tell me, I feel like there's a fetishization of the archive, and the archive that is only found in sort of the British Library or the Kew Gardens, or and the if not the truth, the best way to tell a story. And I feel like while I've tried to be quite methodologically diverse, I have also fallen into that trap. All my sources are English language, or at least the written language. And therefore there's still some, if not colonial, but some sort of, I don't want to use Latin because everything's Latin. It's not. I feel that even whilst trying to fight constant battles, so how do we work on a place if we are familiar with language, so that's one limitation. In terms of the what I try to do is, I think I try to piece together a narrative, and that narrative emerges from sources, and they're very different sources. So if you look at something from a British newspaper, the government, different source to a film, or to a there's sort of schemes of things that are, and a lot of that is about how colonial knowledge, even it's in it, tells stories or tell a sort of coherent story. But I think that working with a whole host of sources was also just a way for me to do an academic project. It helped me look at artifacts, look at a painting, and what does this say about Afghanistan. So it is pretty eclectic. I think there's a method. I try to have I try to look at as many sources as possible and pick those that have a lot of currency. So the painting of Brian, everybody kind of knows about it. So then to try to, but the assumptions behind it, the content, it's a whole host of different sources. I think and it might not again give you the kind of depth that just working with one set of archival records for might do in the field in Afghanistan, and doing an ethnography might do. So different.
Well, so related to that, I mean, one of the things about your sources, and one of the things about the book, and you're very upfront about this, is that this is really the outsider's view looking in. I mean, the title of the book gives it away, Imagining Afghanistan, right? This is about how outsiders imagine this place. And I don't want to say what's lacking in the book, because this isn't necessarily your brief that you took, but I wonder if you could think about how self-imaginaries of Afghans, either from within Afghanistan or the Afghan diaspora, might interact with the story you tell. Do you think there's space for them? Do you think, can the subaltern speak, as it were, either from the inside or the outside in this case?
Yes, I mean, I absolutely think that there's space for them. I think that is because language thing get filtered through, so there's that when we listen, if we probably aren't listening to the subaltern, we're listening to different voices that have already been amplified. Having said that, I don't. There's two different times or two different instances to think of. Sorry, did I get cut off?
No, you're good.
No, okay. Yeah. So there's the story of RAVA, which is the Revolutionary Afghan Women's Association, and they're based in Afghanistan, and they try to complicate both the narratives that Western intervention is going to save the women, and also the narrative that kind of tries to say, actually, the Taliban aren't all that bad. And they talk about how the twin evils of local patriarchy and Western imperial patriarchy actually make their lives worse, and that drowns out their voices and their experiences of those patriarchy, And so there are those stories, and those stories are really, really valid, and they absolutely. There's also people like Entizar, who I spent some time exploring in the first chapter, who has written what's called a 101 on Afghanistan. And a lot of what he does is he says, then this is the trope of the native informant. And he says, Afghanistan, I'll explain this to Americans in 100 pages and just say, Afghans are backwards. They hate women. They don't respect authority. They like to yell. I mean, these kinds of very essentialist and reductionist tropes. But then those get picked up, and so people going out to do something for development enterprise or military action, they read these books and are like, oh, now we know Afghanistan, and it's coming from the mouth of an Afghan, and there's like a veracity to it. So it, just as there's colonial interpretations that are competing, there's lots of different stories of Afghanistan that can be told by Afghans. But that's not something those are not the stories I'm telling, and that's a limitation. But it's also not the project I was initially interested in.
And I think the book does a wonderful job, clearly delineating what you can say with your sources and what you want to say, where you want to intervene. You're not overly ambitious, which is always a problem where the literature is less developed than in other places. I wanted to actually ask, one of the things about the trope in particular, you have, I think it's chapter 3 about tribe. And I was in an email discussion with you about this earlier. Clearly, you take your disciplinary background looking at the political form of the state, which is your first real substantive chapter. Then you talk about the tribe. There's a great discussion of gender that we'll get into in a minute. But I actually want to ask you about something that you don't explicitly talk about in the book, and that is capitalism and capital. Because as a historian, my own reading of Afghanistan is that the emergence of that state and this space in this particular way over the past 2 centuries is an unrecognized story about global capitalism. And I think that you can see spaces in your story. In particular, there's a great passage where you're, of course, talking about the 2014 election and how the Americans then make Abdullah, of all things, the CEO of Afghanistan, right? And then you bring up the Eric Prince Blackwater Wall Street Journal article where he says we should run Afghanistan, like the East India Company did South Asia. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the role of capitalism in this story and what, if any, role you think it plays here.
Yeah, thank you. I think one of my regrets, I suppose, is that I haven't done capitalism enough justice in the story, and global capitalism or racial capitalism in particular. And it rears its head in Afghanistan's history a whole lot of the time. So, in the 1960s and 70s, there's this whole episode that Nick Kalatha talks about damning Afghanistan and Afghanistan becoming the future modernized state, almost like South Korea. And Afghanistan was the future of capitalism, or third world capitalism, if you like. The Soviet intervention in the 1980s and 90s was also about capitalism, and the arming of the Mujahideen in response to the Soviet intervention was also a way of dealing with capitalism, or the story is implicated in capitalism. And Afghanistan itself, or socialism, but it was ultimately not allowed to develop this socialist experiment, I suppose, or its alternative to capitalism, and that was stymied by both the United States and the USSR. So the story of capitalism has become somewhat in this story a story about great powers and the sort of rivalries and proxy, but capitalism is absolutely key. And yes, I think I should have spent a little bit more time exploring it. And yes, in 2014, stuff around the viceroy of Afghanistan and the CEO of Afghanistan, and run it like a trading company, is all about narratives of what colonial capitalism looked like. Some of that is wildly off what it was actually about, but that's another element to the whole capitalism and Afghanistan story.
Well, that just reminds me of the fantastic work that our colleagues Magnus Marston has done on Afghan traders
Yes.
and how Afghanistan is not really thought of as this capitalist space. And yet, when you start to, as it were, proverbially scratch the surface, you find them every place, doing all kinds of interesting things. We're getting a number of questions that push us in a couple of different directions. So I'll do a little bit of dealer's choice, but I will get them in. And I encourage all the participants. I see many of you are posting questions for everybody to see. That's fantastic. Please continue to do so. I'll try and restate your questions to Nivi directly so that we can talk about this more. But we've got a couple here that kind of want to return to this Afghanistan as a case study of this quasi-coloniality, a case study of center periphery, as it were, that obviously Afghanistan is not considered a center by those in power, and yet we have connections and networks which really tie it in globally. In fact, my own PhD student, Ellen Bakhtari, who finished last year, did a fantastic PhD about intellectual connections between Tunisia and the Kabul court in the 1870s, where reformists are talking to each other. So I wonder if you could maybe expand on what you think Afghanistan's exemplary position, as it were, as this quasi-colony, specifically on the side of the British Empire. Does this have an instruction for other quasi-colonies, places like Bhutan, for example? And how does this challenge or collapse our understanding of kind of center periphery dynamics that we've been laden with, both in the theoretical literature, but also in some of the historical narratives?
Yeah, so there's a spatial element to it, right? So Afghanistan is considered a borderland as well, and some of these other spaces are also considered Yemen or Somalia, and they're considered peripheral, but they're also considered on the edge or on the border of civilization. And there's a geospatial imaginary that absolutely complicates the core periphery story. And when I'm thinking about core periphery, I'm thinking a little bit about development dependency theory as well. So the idea that the core tracks from the periphery to keep itself going, etc. But then they also complicate that story with sort of semi-peripheries, and I think that those stories are they're too boxed, and they don't actually get to the nature of, or the complicated and messy nature of colonialism, of post-colonialism. And Bhutan I don't know much about, but I think my sense is that are all quite particular, but from those particularities you can try to universalize or tell a story, a universal story. That's how we can tell the story of colonialism. It's not, British colonialism is not the same as American colonialism, is not the same as French colonialism, is not the same as Chinese colonialism, but those are still instances or manifestations of a dynamic of power, and Afghanistan on the periphery experiences that power sort of differentially, but nevertheless, that has a lot, I think, to say about other places as well. So yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I mean, there's an emerging body of literature that really places Afghanistan, as it were, as an imperial testing ground, where the British develop forms of, you talk about it in your own book, frontier governmentality that are then exported around the empire. One example that jumps directly to mind is the ruling regulation for the FATA, the federally administered tribal areas. The frontier crimes regulation gets reproduced around the British Empire and in substance around the world. So I think you've got a lot to say with that network and periphery issue. And I also enjoy how the book really engages critical geography. I mean, you bring up Derek Gregory's work quite a bit, which is always a joy to read. And I think that nicely ties the historical elements to the more presentist concerns you have and literature that you're discussing. If we can pivot to, I think, what is a very large part of your book, and I'd really kind of like to open it up for you to talk about at length here. You've got two chapters wholly dedicated to the issue of gender, one on women, which I think, you know, as I was reading it, I just had Spivak in the back of my head talking about white men saving brown women from brown men, right? But that trope also applies, and you actually say it in your other chapter, which is about Afghan masculinity. So I wonder if you could just kind of broadly outline the contours of gender as you see it and as you document it in your book. And then if you'd like to go into some further detail, both about as it applies to women and as it applies to masculinity, that would be great.
Yeah, I absolutely. Gender is really key to the Western or Imperial imaginary, and also to the book. In the chapter on women, I show how much of the NATO-led intervention was legitimized to the public through the discourse of saving Afghan women. Afghan women were presented as brutalized in burqas, and they needed us. We had to help. And exactly, many scholars, including Spivak and Leela Abulagod and Chandra Mohanty, to name a few, have spoken or written about how the brown or the Muslim or the third world woman is always victimized and presented as sort of the white man's burden, and in quite diverse and different ways and fascinating ways. And I think Afghanistan is a really good instantiation of that. But I think so before I move on, one of the things that I've been to say is the argument that I make is, and I think this is a misrepresentation of my work, is to say that I'm saying that there's no female oppression in Afghanistan. I absolutely don't want to say that. I focus on imperial patriarchy, but I absolutely recognize the local patriarchy, and precisely one of the ways in which some of the stuff that I pick on that has sort of local connotation, Rava and people in Afghanistan who talk about those two different types of patriarchy, nevertheless nevertheless acting as a sort of, if not a symbiotic, but at least as a bigger whole, or so I do talk about women needing saving and how that then in the first instance takes away from female oppression in the West, but also that doesn't mean that, or doesn't detract from the fact that there is absolutely horrific gender violence in Afghanistan on the ground. The second chapter, on masculinity, I think is actually perhaps a little bit more interesting, because it's also something that's not picked up on as much. There's many representations of Afghan men. So there's the men as unruly, sort of wild tribesmen, but also Afghan men presented as, like I say, queer sodomizers, Pashtun men in particular. So there's a whole narrative about how Afghan men basically perform homosexuality, but it's more bestial, and they're not actually homosexual because they're too repressed, and they're homophobes actually, and they beat their wives, but also they do these awful acts, and they wear kohl or wear makeup, and they dress in a certain colorful way, and it's all very very weird and strange, and this needs to stop. And so there's a desire to sort of teach gender normativity, and it's really strong when it comes to Afghanistan, not just for the women, but also for this thing on masculinity.
Well, I mean, picking up on that issue of masculinity and its approach in Afghanistan, you well document a sense of Afghanistan as a kind of deviant place that is anxiety-producing because it moves away from expectations and accepted social norms. You have a lovely passage about I think it's a British Royal Marines platoon that was deployed and had to. Well, why don't I let you talk about that a little bit? And if you can talk about, what role deviance and anxiety, especially around sexual mores, but more generally, how Afghanistan is really constructed as a deviant place that produces or is produced by Western anxiety about it.
Yeah, so so I think the British Marine was just talking about how they are far more terrified of these Afghan men who mince about wearing sandals than they are of the Taliban or the Al Qaeda. The real enemy and the real danger is the fact that they come to us and make kissing noises and wear lipstick or mascara, and that is a far more threatening presence. These men holding hands is a far more threatening presence to British fighters than the people they're actually fighting. And I think, like you say, that says something about anxiety, about normativity, about trying to capture the essence of a thing by reducing it to either to genders or to sexes, or or homosexuality, heterosexuality. And Afghan men, Pashtun men in particular, in this narrative, quite fit, and therefore they're menacing, they're deviant, and they're threatening. And this is sort of symbolic of a whole host of other British experiences with Afghanistan. So Afghanistan doesn't quite fit the narrative, and therefore it is more dangerous, therefore it's more threatening, and therefore it must be quelled or disappeared. So it can't be tamed. There's an element of almost, what do we do with these men? We have to try to refashion them into our own image, but if we don't, then we just save the women and annihilate this kind of weird masculinity.
Well, and I think that as a historian that really resonates, because there's been some fantastic work by, for instance, Mark Pondus and Elizabeth Kolsky, who've looked at British anxieties around sexual violence towards British Indian women. You know, one of the things that comes out of Lady Sale's journal from the first Anglo-Afghan War is this kind of nascent fear of sexual transgression. I mean, the frontier crimes regulation, the one thing that the British actually put into the court and take out of custom is adultery and rape. So yeah, I think that really resonates. And I wonder if you could then maybe talk about, oh my gosh, I'm going to have an embarrassing senior moment because I just lost my train of thought. Well, why don't we switch gears and I'll come back to that, because I know I've got thanks, Kavita, I appreciate that. I know there's a number of other questions up here. One from my colleague, Deepa Lapali, who's the Associate Director here at the Sigur Center. And this returns you more to your theoretical posting, which is with regard to how you're framing. I had your question up, Deepa, let me just get it. How does your particular post-colonial lens fit into current debates about Afghanistan's own self-image in the current era, given the contending views on how to transform the country now?
So in terms of Afghanistan's own self-image, I can't speak too much fatigue and just a sort of trying to battle crises, that there's just, Afghanistan doesn't seem to have come to the point where it's making a sort of grand gesture of this is what we want, because there's war, there's poverty, there's intervention, there's everything that just seems to have ravaged the country. And my particular post-colonial lens, if you want to call it that, just is trying to show how we are absolutely implicated in that, and how we often try to disavow or distance ourselves from that. Like, so we say, okay, this is a problem, and now we're going to try to fix it, having erased the history of creating that problem, or if not creating it, being at least thoroughly implicated and aggravating that problem. And so it's about how the idea that there is a West and then there's an East, or there's Afghanistan and then there's Britain, and they are very diverse spotted plants historically, is absolutely not the case. And I guess that's what I'm trying to show, that implication, that connection, that imbrication, if you like.
Well, if I can expand on that, actually, we're often bandy about the term post-colonial as a descriptor, post-colonial theory, post-colonial states. And I sometimes think we don't spend enough time actually considering the substance of it. I mean, as we talked about earlier in this discussion, you referred to the quasi-coloniality of Afghanistan. One of our questioners have talked about brought up a question about internal imperialism in Afghanistan. We refer to Pakistan and less so to Afghanistan as post-colonial states. I wonder, putting your theorist hat on for a minute and making this intervention, I mean, when you use that term post-colonial, or when that term is ascribed to you, what do you make of that term? You know, how much of the world that we live in now is the colonial world continuing in the after effects, the aftermath of the death of empire, as it were?
Yeah, I'm a little bit skeptical of the term post-colonial, not only because it implies a sort of temporal past, you know, so that was the colonial and now we're the post-colonial. I think almost all post-colonial theorists would say that's not what post-colonialism does. It shows, in fact, the continuity in that project. But I think that project can then homogenize it, and this is kind of the complication with Afghanistan, or the quasi nature of it. It's not a properly post-colonial country, and yet it behaves in a post-colonial way, or we understood it through the lens of post-colonialism often. And so that story is a little bit complicated. But also, I think the more I think about it, I feel like because of my political commitment, I almost feel like the word anti-colonial now makes more sense than post-colonial. So I want to keep alive that project of critique, but also show one that's not a homogeneous or monolithic project, and also that it's a project that is ongoing and that, for me, needs to be countered and defeated.
Well, this goes to the kind of activist element of your scholarship, the anti-colonial, or as it were, decolonizing the academy. And that brings me to one of the questions from our audience that also returns us to the issue of gender. This is somebody who works in the international NGO sector. Work within that sector. I just lost it. Somebody had it. I work within that sector, the international NGOs, as an executive at Women for Women International, which has a 100% Afghan team, including the country director, but which still exists within this colonial sector that we are talking about. She writes, as we seek to further decolonize our organization and the sector, what would your advice, based on your study of colonization more broadly and vis-a-vis Afghanistan in particular, be? So kind of how would you put your scholarship of decolonization into action in the international NGO world?
Great question. I think my own way of doing this, which might not be a very practical way, is to look at the categories used by development and then complicate those. So first, even the very category of development assumes that there is an underdeveloped that needs to move into the developed in a certain kind of, through a certain kind of trajectory. But then a lot of the ways in which we encounter or think about or interact with places that we consider underdeveloped, we already assume that there's certain that need to be fixed. And I think to start to think about those categories that need to be fixed, for instance, state failure or corruption, or to question those and think about why they came about, and perhaps to read as widely as possible, and obviously, like you say, to bring more people on the ground into the fray. Those are all extremely important things. But from a knowledge sort of production point of view, I think I'd really my own interest is in countering some taxonomies and categories of thought through which we make sense. And there's a lot of those that development and developmental thinkers and organizations use. And I guess that's trying to solve something.
Yeah. Well, I love how you keep coming back to the issue of knowledge production, because I think anybody who's worked in a substantive way on this space is on the one hand taken by the authority with which foreigners in particular, but colonial officials, be they British or Russian or even American, talk about Afghanistan, that they actually really assert that they are people knowledgeable about this space. And is yet, as you point out, and is so clear, implicit in the work, that knowledge is really A, manufactured, and B, extraordinarily thin, if not wholly wrong. And so I wonder if you would maybe talk about this tension a little bit, because on the one hand, you're very based in the knowledge production paradigm from Foucault and its importance in power production, or rather the importance of power in producing knowledge. But on the other hand, we are faced with a whole industry. I mean, Martin Bailey calls them knowledge entrepreneurs, a whole industry of Afghan hands that really just are kind of regurgitating the same tropes over and over and over again. So I wonder if you could talk about that tension.
Yeah, I think that tension is actually almost a crisis. There's an epistemological crisis in Afghanistan, right? Because there's knowledge entrepreneurs, like Martin says, but there isn't the same sort of knowledge apparatus or knowledge industry. And a lot of the stuff on Afghanistan has just been mined. So, you know, they look at Elphinstone stacks, or somebody who's, this is what Afghan men are like, or this is what the political topography in Afghanistan is like. These are the tribes, this is how they organize themselves, and this is what we should do. So absolutely. One, there is like the sort of crisis and anxiety around not actually having that knowledge, and then the problem is the knowledge itself, right? So then there's imperial knowledge, which is far more difficult to untangle, because that's how we know that a lot of epistemology is just imperial epistemology. That's how I've been trained. That's what most knowledge traditions in the academy, and especially in the Western academy, are like. And I think in the book, I would consider myself a Foucauldian in that whole power knowledge sort of aspect. But I think more recently, I've started complicating that too. And, you know, there's some great work done on how Foucault himself is actually using paradigms, if you want to call them that, or ways of thinking, modes of thinking, even while he critiques them, that are colonial, that are Western, that are imperial. So I think so there's a tension when it comes to Afghanistan. There's a tension in the knowledge edifice, but then there's also a tension in my own thinking, and I think your question kind of gestures to that.
So we've got another question that moves us in a slightly different direction, but which you actually address at length in your book when you talk about the romance lectures by Curzon and the role of the frontier and its natural, as it were, history. So we've got a question here. How does natural history, physical geography, play into the imagination of Afghanistan as an unconquered frontier, which creates insecurity for the empire? Could you please talk about the knowledge-making aspect of colonial missions to Afghanistan? And I just add on this, I mean, you know, there's been tons of work, for example, on Elphinstone's mission, but a lot of it really focuses on the production of the anthropologizing, as it were, of Afghans. And it talks about how the people of Afghanistan are thought about and constructed. And I think this question, but also you raise it in your book, is the physical space of Afghanistan, because that's often kind of forgotten or ignored, and how that shapes the ways in which we imagine it. I mean, there's the trope of the hard wild tribesmen that, you know, inhabit the hard frontier lands, but I think there's more to it that you talk about in your book, and I would really appreciate if you could expand on that a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to ask you if you wanted to take the first stab, because a lot of what I've got from on the book on in terms of Elphinstone's mission and all that is from your book, and the way in which um, Afghan terrain was encountered, and that was absolutely key. But I mean, the one thing I would like to say about this is that absolutely the idea that Afghanistan is this wild, rugged frontier that then creates wild, rugged people is key to British frontier mentality or governmentality. And so physical geography, the notion that Afghanistan is unconquerable because it has a climate that is hospitable, because it has mountains and passes and that are just that nobody can actually pass, and that's super key to the Anglophone colonial knowledge production from the British Empire onwards. So yeah, that's a really good question.
Well, the one thing I would add, and to put it to your contemporary focus, is as you write in the book, since the American intervention in 2001, there was, especially under the Petraeus period, a big focus on trying to understand Afghanistan, and the most, as it were, noxious element of that, or example of that, was the human terrain system, which you write about in the book and which has been critiqued by a number of scholars. But what's interesting is what comes after that human terrain system, which is after the US military kind of feels like, well, these people are a little bit, they're too complicated, they're too wily, we can't quite figure them out. What is something that isn't complicated and wily? It's the physical terrain and the kind of mathematical terrain. And so it's I think the program that follows that is something called Nexus 7, where it's actually returning to mathematical algorithms of trying to figure out people and their relationship to the land, with a focus on land as being kind of the key element, as opposed to how people interact with the land. So I as it were, tip my hat to you, because you really do explore that in the book, talking especially about the post 2001 American intervention. I'm going to kind of open it up here in the sense of returning to your position, as it were, as an activist scholar. You make an important intervention here about the way we imagine Afghanistan and how problematic that is. So kind of in a gesture to my more practical colleagues, my political sciences colleagues where I teach, is the so what question. What are we supposed to do with this? What if you could, have 5 minutes with a decision maker, would you say that you would like us to take away and actually act upon from this scholarship? If you're making an intervention, if you're being an activist scholar, what do you want us to take away here?
That's a really, really good and really tough question. So a part of me is like, okay, why, if you are decision makers and you've been making the decision, then please clear up the mess. Another part of me is just like, no, just stay away from it. You've done enough. Just move and don't come back. No, but I think like the first thing is just humility, right? Like, we can't know everything. We don't know everything. The idea that we want to impose a vision on another place is problematic in and of itself, but then also that vision is already something that that is filtered through with a Western sort of or colonial bias, if you like. So those are quite abstract ways of saying that. Be a little bit more sort of humble, try to read up more than just what your sources, your obvious sources are, and also spend some time interacting with the people on the ground and have a better understanding of history. I think there's a lot of ahistoricism that often gets us into spots when we're sort of intervening in the 21st century, forgotten what's come before, how we were implicated in it in the past, etc. So I guess that's a sort of broad answer to that question.
Although you bring up this issue of history, and it's interesting because you address that directly in the in the text as well. The misnomer of Afghanistan as the graveyard of empires. Seth Jones, who was at the Rand Corporation and had a direct line to Dick Cheney, made hay, as it were, out of that, using that as the title of his book about Afghanistan, the graveyard of empires. And so it seems like it's not just an ahistoriosity that's going on in this knowledge production. It seems that there's either an intellectual laziness or unintentional warping of what history is and can tell us and inform us about this place.
Yes, there's definitely an intellectual laziness, and that comes from imperial hubris, and there is a warping, there's a distortion. Sometimes it's willful, and sometimes it's just neglectful. But you're right, there's an active intellectual inability or reluctance to deal with his history, if you like. Yeah.
So I'm conscious of time, and I just do a kind of last call out for questions from the audience as we continue our conversation here. If you have anything more you'd like to be addressed here, please do get it in the chat box. We'll continue our conversation. I'll get to it here shortly. But I wanted to, as it were, I know in talking about this, and as anybody who's produced a book well knows, the publication is almost an anticlimax in the sense of this is a project that is now behind you, and now you're being asked to talk about it and, as it were, relive it when intellectually you're someplace else. And so I wonder if you might tell us a little bit about where you are intellectually, namely, what are you working on now, and how does it both connect with Imagining Afghanistan, and how does it differ from it?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so some of the things that you actually asked me about have intimate some of the new project. So the new project looks at as in borderlands, but it tries to. It's very nascent, very embryonic, I should say. So I don't, it's going to change as it goes. But it looks at how 4 sort of mid-century, mid-20th century thinkers in different parts of the world. Gloria Anzaldúa, Huey Newton, Jean Genet, and Tamsula Ao looked at the processes of borders and of bordering. So there's a sort of literature element to it, and it looks at, and the sort of connective dot is racial capitalism and abolition geography at the moment. So in the 21st century, there's a lot of talk about getting rid of borders or problematizing borders as violent entities, and some of that I want to tie into a historical discussion by looking at people who aren't considered, or except for Anzaldúa perhaps, thinkers of the border. So it's looking at different bordering sites and what it says about processes of borders, but also what it says about a sort of 21st century myopia when it comes to borders, and how there might be better ways or more creative or ingenious ways of resisting the border and thinking about it, etc. So that's the.
Well, when you talk about borders, I assume that's one of the connective tissues between your work Imagining Afghanistan and this new work, which the clear implication is thinking of Afghanistan writ large as a border or as a borderland, exactly, yeah. Which I think implicitly comes through in the book. And I wonder if you could expand on that a little bit. How do you conceive that? What does it mean to think of this space? And I think this goes to the kind of liminal space. You talk about Afghanistan as a borderland, as a liminal space, a space of exception. And that's something we haven't really addressed in our conversation thus far.
Historically, Afghanistan was considered a sort of border, or perhaps a buffer between India, British India, and Russia, and it was important for that. But more recently, there's also been the talk of Afghanistan, specifically the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan, as just being a lawless frontier. And Obama's envoy also talked about how basically it doesn't make sense to think of Afghanistan as a proper state and to actually merge the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan into one unified theater of war. By that, he meant it would be easier to to basically drop drones into that space if it wasn't thought of as a sovereign entity. So Afghanistan is often thought about as not quite an independent state, as bordering, but it is also regionally, like the regional appellations don't quite capture Afghanistan too. It sits on the borders of, for instance, Central Asia and South Asia, and even sometimes the Middle East. And so Afghanistan's periphery, marginal border-like status is definitely is something that was in the book, and that idea of borders, but then more than borders, of borderlands and bordering, and what those processes do and what they depend on is absolutely key to the next project.
It's so interesting to me, having been in this field for longer than I would like to admit at this point, that so many of us that approach Afghanistan from a scholarly point of view do end up thinking about it as this peripheral space, this border space, and that there's a conversation to be had about that. And I think what you just said there, and what definitely comes through in the book, is it's a kind of spatialized non-space, as it were, where it has a particular geography, but it's a geography, as it were, of absence, where you can do things like the drone war that Derek Gregory and others have written about, especially in the former FATA regions. Mm-hmm. I've got a doozy for you from one of our audience members, so I put your thinking cap on for this one, but it's quite a good one. She writes, the encounters between colonial masculinities and the men and performances of masculinity in Afghanistan described before appears like an annihilation of difference, which links to the mathematical equations to make Afghanistan flat terrain. Do you see a reproduction of sameness in terms of colonial imagination of Afghanistan's men, or changes at different points in history, or with different agents doing the imagining?
So I'm just going to call this one out because she's in the next room and throwing me all these difficult questions from thanks, Catherine. That's a great question. It's a lot, so I'm thinking about it. I don't think it's an annihilation of difference. Although, yes, there's definitely a flatness, a trying to symmetricize, I just made up a word, or to make flat or to render legible, absolutely. And I think that's where the colonial anxiety stems from, that Afghanistan is not quite the same. It's similar and it tells similar stories, but there's also a difference to it. And that is not only different in different points in history, but because it's kind of been picked up and dropped, there's an ebb and flow of imperial knowledge, a sameness is imposed on it, and that sameness doesn't capture it. It isn't quite rendered legible through those things in terms of masculinity, but also in terms of women and tribes, etc. And that does have different agential positions, but it's also just the fact that there's gaps in A, the colonial edifice, and B, in the ways in which Afghanistan is imagined. There's just not, the story is just not, it's just too holy. All stories are, but I mean, by which I mean there's too many holes in it. And that so there's a ascribed sameness, and that sameness is then met with its own limits in that it is not same, and that has implications for how we intervene in and interact with Afghanistan.
Okay, we've got one more question from the audience, which makes me think immediately of Nick Cutheder's book. So you can be ready for this one. It says, "Hi Nivi, thanks for the talk. I'm wondering if you think imperial technologies such as irrigation, dams, played a role in the construction technology or ideas about technology imprint itself onto the idea of Afghanistan."
Yes, absolutely. I also think immediately of Nick Kalatha's book, and especially his article called Damning Afghanistan, in which he talks about how imperial technologies and specifically irrigation played a role in the construction of Afghanistan. First, when these big dams were being built, Afghanistan was the future. Afghanistan was absolutely the thing that would be, South Asia's or the Middle East answer to South Korea. And then when that didn't go so well, or was not actually carried through properly, then Afghanistan became a terrain that was hostile. I mean, it wasn't quite that easy, but there's an arc to that. So technology and ideas about technology absolutely themselves into the ideas of Afghanistan. And one of the ways this does that is also through stories of how the Taliban are considered backwards, but then they're not actually that backwards, and then we're technologically backward, that is, and then we're confounded by that. Or a lot of the stories about the Mujahideen beating the Soviet Union was all about these men, just warrior men through sheer will, killing the enemy and winning the war. But actually, there was huge amounts of technology and funding that was diverted to the Mujahideen through Pakistan and through the United States. And so there's a strange thing. Like the backwardness is ascribed to Afghanistan through or because of its lack of technology. But one, that's not as straightforward a story as it seems like, and two, it absolutely helps us to conjure this image of Afghanistan as retrogressive and not quite of the modern world.
And there's some great work that I'll just give a quick shout out. I know Shah Mahmood Hanifi has been working on the machine Hana, established by the Kabul court in the late 19th century, not only for weapons manufacturing, but also for print technologies and how that fits into nationalist discourses about language, that Pashto really becomes patronized as a state language from the late 19th century onwards. I want to be sure and give you and your text the final word here, and so I'm gonna throw a quotation out from the coda that I'd like your comments on, and then we can let you have the last word and wrap this up. But you write at the very end of your book that Afghanistan is alternately construed as a familiar other, its women depicted as needing to be saved, its state decried as a failure, and its male population portrayed as wild frontiersmen, and as a place of mystery and indeterminacy, its borders tenuous, its history uncertain, and its future ambiguous, but overdetermined. Afghanistan, as a discursive regime, functions both in the broad framework assigned to the colonial other and in registers that are under-theorized and not fully institutionalized, and is restricted to the quasi-colonial zones of exception. I think that's a very, I think it sums up the message of your book nicely, but I just wonder if you would like to maybe either comment or expand on that.
So I think so some of this goes back to our discussion, right? It's just trying to say that that Afghanistan is overdetermined because there is a story that has always ascribed to it. So, Afghanistan is backward, Afghanistan's women need saving, Afghanistan's tribes are unruly, etc. But it's also under-theorized in that it seems to have not that much scholarly attention dedicated to it. And there's some great exceptions, and one of them is you, but there is, and also policy, it comes and goes. There's imperial interest that waxes and wanes, and therefore it's also under-theorized. And this is specifically the quasi-colonial of Afghanistan and peripheries like it, where it is where we try to make sense of it through very hasty or cliched idioms, and then not only capture the reality or the contested reality, but also end up making things worse and intervening in a manner that leads to a worse outcome. I mean, I'm not trying to say that should be good and is good, but that specifically with Afghanistan, there is a whole litany of imperial mistakes that are owed to hubris and lack of understanding and resource.
Well, with that damning indictment, I think I think we've just about come up to time. I really want to give a shout out about the book. It's an absolutely fantastic read. Helen has very kindly in the chat box put a link up. You can get it on Cambridge. We've got a 20% discount on the book. You can get it directly from the publisher, Cambridge, bookshop.org, and any other major retailer of books, Powell's, Amazon, et cetera, et cetera. So I really encourage all of you to pick it up at some point. As I said, I was given my copy yesterday and spent all morning reading it and loved it. So I hope that as we're all, locked down and have tons of time to do such things, you'd consider picking up Nivi's book. Congratulations, Nivi. It's a wonderful work.
Thank you so much.
It's a really important.
Great questions.
Yeah, it's a really important piece of scholarship too. I think you make an important intervention there. Just a final reminder before we leave. This has been our second New Books in Asian Studies. This is now a monthly thing we're having going on. So if you enjoyed this, we hope to see you back because the Sigur Center is responsible for all of Asia. We move around a bit. Last month was China, this month Afghanistan. Next month, I can't recall off the top of my head. I think we have either South Asia or Southeast Asianists. But please do come back and see us. And I certainly hope in a world in the future, we'll all be able to meet and congratulate Nivi for a job well done and a fantastic read.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day or night, wherever you may be.
Thank you.